My name is Elena. I'm 85 years old. And right now, I'm sitting in a living room that my husband would have hated. There are books scattered across the floor because I stopped caring where they belong. Dust drifts slowly through the afternoon sunlight. A half-empty wine glass sits beside a cracked plate. And in the corner, there's a grand piano with its lid wide open. Sheet music spilling everywhere like a confession nobody could keep buried anymore. The room is messy, loud, alive, which is strange because for most of my life I lived in silence so perfect it felt holy. For 50 years I was the ideal wife. Elegant house, respected husband, beautiful dinners, controlled smiles. People envied me everywhere I went. They thought I had won at life, but they never saw the real cost. I spent half a century learning how to disappear without making a sound. And then came the horrifying part. Nobody trapped me with violence. Nobody screamed. Nobody hit me. My marriage looked like paradise. That was the trap. Because the most dangerous prisons don't feel like prisons at all. They feel safe. They feel respectable. They feel quiet. Until one day you wake up old and realize you traded your entire soul for peace that was never really peace. It took me 50 years to become the perfect wife. And another 10 years to become human again. The strange thing is, I didn't walk into that cage by accident. I walked into it willingly. Because when you grow up in chaos long enough, control starts to look like love. My parents were artists, brilliant people, passionate people, the kind of people who could turn an ordinary dinner into poetry or into a war zone. Our house was always loud, music blasting at midnight, paint on the walls, cigarette smoke in the curtains. Some nights they danced in the kitchen like they were the only two people alive. Other nights they screamed so violently I would lock myself in the bathroom and sit on the floor covering my ears. And money disappeared as quickly as their emotions changed. Bills piled up unopened. The electricity was shut off twice before I turned 12. We moved constantly. Small apartments, cheap houses, strange neighborhoods. I never unpacked fully because I learned early that nothing lasted very long in our family. People think children want excitement. They don't. Children want predictability. They want to know the lights will stay on. They want silence that feels safe. And I was ashamed all the time. Ashamed of the noise. Ashamed of the instability. Ashamed of never knowing what version of my parents would walk through the door. So while other girls dreamed about romance, I dreamed about order. I dreamed about clean kitchens, folded towels, quiet evenings, and a man who never lost control of himself. I thought safety would heal me. I thought stability would save me. But trauma is dangerous like that. Sometimes it doesn't push you toward the wrong people. Sometimes it pushes you toward the wrong life. And then, I met Julian. I was 23 years old, exhausted from a lifetime of emotional noise, when he walked into my life looking less like a man, and more like certainty itself. Julian was a cardiothoracic surgeon finishing his residency. Everything about him was precise, controlled, measured. Even the way he spoke sounded rehearsed, as if every sentence had already been edited before leaving his mouth. He never interrupted people, never raised his voice, never drank too much, never lost himself emotionally. Around him, the world felt quiet in a way I had never experienced before. My father entered rooms like a storm. Julian entered them like a locked vault. And I mistook that stillness for safety. That was the beginning. He didn't flirt much. He didn't chase me passionately or write love letters. There were no dramatic kisses in the rain, no reckless emotion, and strangely that made me trust him more. He felt solid, predictable, impossible to embarrass me. When I sat beside him at restaurants, I never worried about what might happen next. For someone raised in chaos, that feeling can become addictive very quickly. I remember the night he proposed with terrifying clarity. White tablecloth, dim lighting, a tiny velvet box placed carefully beside my wine glass. Julian looked at me calmly and said, "Elena, we would make an excellent team. A team. Not soulmates. Not lovers. Not, I can't live without you." Then he smiled slightly and added, "You have grace. I have ambition. Together we could build a remarkable life." And I said yes. Not because my heart was racing, but because for the first time in my life, I felt safe. I didn't realize yet that peace and love are not always the same thing. Before I became Mrs. Moore, I was a pianist. Not the kind who played softly in hotel lounges while people clinked wine glasses. I played like someone trying to survive. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, violent music, hungry music. I poured every feeling I wasn't allowed to express into those keys. Anger, fear, loneliness, desire. The piano was the only place where I stopped pretending to be composed. It was my voice before I learned how to silence it. And at first, Julian seemed to admire that part of me. At least, I thought he did. A few months after we married, I was playing late one evening while he was reading in the next room. I remember the piece clearly. Loud, emotional, the kind of music that shakes the walls a little. Julian appeared quietly in the doorway, still wearing his hospital coat. He didn't yell. He never yelled. That would have been easier to fight against. Instead, he waited patiently for me to finish. Then he smiled gently and rubbed his temples. "Elena," he said softly, "it's beautiful, but after the hospital, I need peace when I come home." Peace. That word again. He walked toward the piano slowly and lowered the lid with both hands. Carefully, tenderly almost. Then he kissed my forehead like I was a child who simply didn't understand. "Maybe play when I'm not here," he whispered. And the terrible thing is, that sounded reasonable to me. So I stopped playing when he was home. Then I stopped playing in the evenings. Then only on weekends. Then almost never at all. A year later, we renovated the living room. The designer suggested the piano made the space feel too crowded. Julian agreed immediately. I remember standing there in silence while strangers measured the room around my instrument like it was an inconvenience that needed to disappear. And eventually, I sold it. I told myself it was just a piano, just wood and strings. But now, looking back, I understand what really happened that day. I didn't sell an instrument. I sold the last honest part of myself. After the piano disappeared, something in me became quieter too. And once you stop fighting to be yourself, people start rewarding you for it. By my early 30s, I had become exactly the kind of wife Julian wanted beside him. Elegant, controlled, effortless from the outside. I learned how to host dinner parties for surgeons, investors, and hospital board members without ever appearing stressed. Candles lit at the right hour. Wine paired correctly. Napkins folded perfectly. I learned how to laugh softly at the right moments and how to disappear politely when conversations turned important. Even my smile changed over the years. Smaller, more restrained. Julian used to say, "Strong emotions make people uncomfortable." So I trained myself to become emotionally invisible. And the frightening part is society applauded me for it. People called me graceful, refined, classy. What they really meant was quiet. Because in our house, everything had to remain under control. The furniture, the schedules, the conversations. Even feelings had rules attached to them. Julian believed emotional discipline was the highest form of intelligence. To him, tears were irrational. Anger was embarrassing. Vulnerability was weakness dressed up as honesty. And eventually, our children learned that language too. I remember one afternoon when our son Michael was 6 years old. He fell in the driveway while riding his bicycle and scraped his knee badly. Blood streamed down his shin as he ran toward the house crying for me. Instinct took over immediately. I rushed toward him, ready to pull him into my arms. But before I could touch him, Julian stepped between us. He crouched down calmly in front of Michael and held him by the shoulders. "Control yourself," he said firmly. "Panic solves nothing." Michael tried to stop crying instantly. His little chest kept shaking as he swallowed the sobs back down. Then Julian handed him a towel and told him to clean himself up in the bathroom. Alone. And I did something that still haunts me 40 years later. Nothing. I said nothing. I watched my 6-year-old son learn that pain should be hidden before I ever taught him that pain deserved comfort. That was the day emotional silence stopped being a marriage rule. It became an inheritance. The years passed quietly after that. Not quickly. Quietly. There's a difference. People always say time flies, but in controlled marriages like mine, time doesn't fly. It marches. Cleanly. Predictably. Without surprise. From the outside, our life looked extraordinary. We traveled constantly. Paris in the spring. Rome in the summer. Tokyo during cherry blossom season. Morocco one winter when Julian decided we needed something culturally stimulating. We stayed in beautiful hotels with polished marble floors and staff who greeted Julian like royalty. Every trip had a printed itinerary prepared weeks in advance. Breakfast at 7. Museum at 9. Lunch reservation at 12:30. No deviations. No wandering. No getting lost. Especially not getting lost. And somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing that we weren't actually experiencing the world anymore. We were inspecting it. I remember Morocco most clearly. Maybe because it was the first time I truly felt the bars of the cage around me. We were walking through a crowded market in Marrakesh. The air smelled like cinnamon, sweat, smoke, and roasted meat. Fabrics in violent colors hung from every doorway. Music echoed through the narrow streets. Life was everywhere. Loud, messy, beautiful. And for one brief moment, I wanted to disappear into it. I wanted to sit on the ground beside strangers drinking tea. I wanted to buy something useless. I wanted to feel alive instead of appropriate. But Julian tightened his hand around my wrist almost immediately. "It's dirty here," he said calmly. "Too chaotic. Let's go back to the hotel." So we left. We flew all the way to Morocco just to eat French food in a silent air-conditioned dining room that looked exactly like every other wealthy hotel in the world. And sitting there that night, staring at my untouched wine glass, I suddenly realized something terrifying. I wasn't living my life anymore. I was watching it from behind glass, like a tourist observing someone else's existence. And somehow, the more invisible I became, the more people admired my life. That's the cruel part no one talks about. At charity galas and hospital events, Women would pull me aside while Julian stood across the room surrounded by important men in expensive suits. They would look at him with admiration, then look back at me almost wistfully. "You're so lucky, Elena. Julian is such an extraordinary man. You have the perfect marriage." And from the outside, maybe it did look perfect. The big colonial house, the polished silver, the vacations, the stability. My husband's reputation opened doors everywhere we went. People treated us like we were some kind of elegant success story aging beautifully in public. But what terrified me was how badly I wanted to scream every time someone said I was lucky. Because how do you explain emotional suffocation to people who only understand visible pain? Julian never humiliated me publicly, never cheated, never drank, never hit me. He simply built a life so controlled, so emotionally airless, that eventually I stopped existing inside it. And when the whole world envies your cage, you start wondering if maybe the problem is you. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe wanting more than safety made me selfish. So instead of questioning the life I was living, I started correcting myself. I lost weight because Julian preferred me thinner. I spoke less because he admired restraint. I stopped laughing too loudly. Stopped expressing strong opinions. Stopped wearing bright colors. Little by little, I made myself smaller so his world could remain comfortable. And the frightening thing about disappearing slowly is that nobody notices while it's happening, not even you. I think a part of me knew the truth long before I was willing to admit it. But the real awakening didn't come from a tragedy. It came from music. I was 50 years old when I ran into David again. We had studied together at the conservatory decades earlier. Back then, he was brilliant and reckless, the kind of pianist professors secretly feared because he played with too much emotion. One evening, I saw his name outside a tiny jazz club downtown. And, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I went inside alone. The place was small. Dim lights, sticky tables, cheap whiskey. Nothing about it looked impressive. David was older now. Gray hair, wrinkled suit, no expensive watch, no prestige. If Julian had seen him, he probably would have called him a man who wasted his potential. But then David started playing. And suddenly the entire room came alive. He played like a starving man finally allowed to speak. Sweat rolled down his face. He laughed while his fingers crashed against the keys. The music was messy, unpredictable, human. People in the audience were crying, smiling, drinking, shouting. Nobody cared about elegance. Nobody cared about control. And sitting there in the dark, I felt something crack open inside me. Because I realized I hadn't seen real aliveness in decades. Not in my marriage. Not in my house. Not even in myself. After the performance, David sat with me at the bar for a while. We talked awkwardly at first, like old ghosts trying to remember each other. Then he looked down at my perfectly manicured hands and asked quietly, "Do you still play?" I told him no. I said life became busy. Responsibilities. Children. Marriage. David stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head gently. "That's not true, Elena," he said softly. "You have time. You just don't have the courage." I felt those words hit somewhere deep inside my chest. On the drive home, I pulled my car to the side of the road and cried so hard I could barely breathe. Because for the first time in my life, I understood what I had really traded away. Not freedom, not passion, myself. I had exchanged my soul for safety. For a few dangerous minutes that night, I almost disappeared. I remember sitting in my car with the engine running, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. The city lights blurred through my tears while one thought repeated itself over and over inside my head. Just drive. Don't go home. Keep going. And for the first time in my entire adult life, freedom didn't feel impossible. It felt close. Terrifyingly close. I imagined checking into some cheap motel under a fake name, getting a small apartment somewhere nobody knew me, buying another piano, starting over before it was too late. But then reality arrived quietly, the way fear always does. I was 50 years old. I had no career, no money that Julian didn't control, no real work experience outside of hosting dinners and managing appearances. Even worse, I no longer knew who I was without him. That was the true damage of those years. Not that Julian controlled my life, but that eventually I handed him my identity willingly. And suddenly the unknown felt enormous, cold, bottomless, while the cage at least felt familiar, warm, safe. People love to ask why unhappy people stay, but they don't understand something important. A familiar prison can feel safer than freedom. So eventually I wiped my face, fixed my makeup in the mirror and drove home. Julian looked up briefly from his medical journal when I walked inside. "How was your evening?" he asked calmly. I swallowed everything I was feeling and answered the same way I always had. "Fine." And just like that, I abandoned myself one more time. And then one morning, Julian died. There was no long illness, no dramatic goodbye, no final confession about hidden regrets. He suffered a massive stroke while sitting in his leather chair reading the Wall Street Journal. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. Quietly, efficiently, exactly the way he had lived. I remember staring at his body in the hospital room, waiting to feel something enormous. After all, this was the man I had spent almost my entire life beside. 50 years of marriage, shared houses, shared children, shared routines so deeply ingrained they felt mechanical. But all I felt was numb exhaustion. The funeral was flawless, of course. Julian would have appreciated that. The mayor attended. Surgeons flew in from different states. The hospital dedicated an entire wing in his honor. People lined up to tell me what an extraordinary man my husband had been. They held my hands with pity in their eyes. "Poor Elena. How will you survive without him?" And I nodded politely while feeling like a ghost watching someone else's tragedy unfold. But then came the moment that still terrifies me to admit out loud. After the funeral, I returned home alone. The guests were gone. The house was silent again. I stood in the middle of the living room staring at the untouched furniture, waiting for grief to crush me. Instead, I took the deepest breath of my life. My shoulders loosened, my chest opened, and suddenly I realized something horrifying. For 50 years I had been holding my breath without even knowing it. That day, standing alone in that perfect house, I did not feel destroyed. I felt free. That first night alone in the house felt unreal. No footsteps upstairs. No schedules waiting on the kitchen counter. No careful voice reminding me to lower the volume of my existence. Just silence. Endless silence. I walked slowly through the rooms like a stranger visiting a museum after closing time. Everything looked untouched. Perfectly arranged books. Perfectly aligned chairs. Perfectly folded blankets. And everywhere I looked beige. Beige walls. Beige carpets. Beige curtains. An entire life drained of color in the name of elegance. and suddenly I couldn't stand it anymore. I went into the kitchen, opened a bottle of red wine, and carried it back into the living room with shaking hands. I stood there staring at the cream-colored carpet Julian loved so much. Then, without thinking, I poured the wine directly onto it. The dark red stain spread instantly across the fabric like blood finally reaching a dead body. Ugly, chaotic, impossible to clean completely. And for one suspended moment I just stared at it. Then I started laughing. Not politely, not gracefully. Real laughter. The kind that breaks apart halfway and turns into sobbing. I collapsed onto the floor crying and laughing at the same time because after 50 years of protecting perfection, I had finally destroyed something beautiful. And it felt wonderful. And strangely enough, my life began after that stain. A few months later, I bought another piano. A black Steinway Grand, far too large for the room and far too expensive for a woman my age, according to my children. I placed it exactly where Julian's favorite antique chair used to sit. And every night I play. My fingers are slower now. Arthritis twists the joints. I miss notes constantly. Sometimes the rhythm falls apart halfway through a piece. But for the first time in my life, music is no longer about perfection. It's about truth. And truth trembles sometimes. Then the rest of my life began changing too. I stopped dyeing my hair and let it turn completely white. Julian used to say gray hair made women look tired. Well, I was tired. Tired of pretending otherwise. I started painting messy watercolor landscapes that stained my clothes and floors. I made new friends who would never have survived in my old social circle. A bakery owner who laughed too loudly. A young music teacher covered in tattoos. We drink cheap wine together, listen to old records, and talk honestly about loneliness, regret, and heartbreak. My children don't understand any of it. The first time they visited after I changed the house, they looked around like they had entered the wrong address. Books everywhere. But aging has taught me something unexpected too. Growing older is not about becoming invisible. It's about finally seeing clearly. At 85, I understand now that peace is not the absence of noise. Peace is the freedom to hear your own voice without fear. It's eating ice cream at midnight if you want to, playing piano badly with the windows open,